All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Slava Gerovitch from MIT. Welcome to the joint meeting of Chorus, Colloquium for the History of Russian and Soviet Science, and another virtual platform, History of Science in Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. Today's session will be devoted to the new book by Ksenia Tatarchenko, Soviet Siberia, The Politics of Expertise and the Novosibirsk Scientific Center. Today, we'll hear a presentation by Ksenia and then comments by Ivan Boldyrev and Katja Doose. And then Ksenia will have a chance to respond to their remarks, and then the floor will be open for questions. So let me now introduce Ksenia. I met her when she was a graduate student, and now she's a full-grown scholar. It's wonderful. So Ksenia is a specialist in late Soviet history and the Cold War history of computing and AI. She has taught in the United States, Switzerland, and Singapore, and works currently at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. She received her PhD from the History of Science program at Princeton. Her dissertation, A House with a Window to the West, the Akademgorodok Computer Center, 1958-1993, was awarded the Charles Babbage Institute Tomasz Fellowship. Her publications include the article Algorithms Cradle, commemorating Al-Khwarizmi in the Soviet history of mathematics and Cold War computer science, published in Osiris, and a special issue of Cahiers d'Histoire Russe, The Lives of Science Under Late Socialism, co-edited with Gregory Dufault. So Ksenia, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, for those of you who are in the audience. But yes, maybe I will, Slava started this, I think I should continue. Yes, I do have like a special thought about Slava, because not only I met him when I was a graduate student, actually met him a bit before. So in a sense, like Slava was this kind of figure that showed that doing history of computing in Soviet spaces is possible, right? Because that was actually connected to the project that I started back in the days when I was doing my master's at the Sorbonne. So I found Slava's book, and then yeah, so it's even longer than that. And actually, I would really want us to have maybe me speaking a bit less, but having at least a couple of minutes for Slava to say at least something, because he was like reading this book before everyone in many sense, because I understand that he is like was reviewing it. So maybe you have some thoughts to say. Yeah, so it would be kind of great to, because you're kind of involved in many ways, right, with this project. And actually, again, Kruzhok is also not for nothing, because of course, actually, probably the most difficult and most challenging chapter of the book, which was not even supposed to be there, it's the chapter 6, which deals with kind of the cultural notion of intelligence, is also the chapter that I workshopped here. So yeah, so the kind of the connection to Kruzhok is profound, and thanks also for Jan for hosting this on his roundtables for the book launch series. I was thinking very hard about how to present the book to a community where I feel really that I belong, right? And I don't need to prove that, history of science, history of late Soviet science matters, because that's very often the case, as many of you know, when we talk to our colleagues in different fields. So that's sort of the way you present your arguments is somewhat different. So I was thinking that I'm not going to show slides. I probably would rather share kind of the challenges that I thought I had in working on this project, because I think this is probably where we will strongly connect, because maybe some of those challenges are the same that you are facing at this moment. So this is sort of how I think I'll be kind of structuring the time that I have today. All right, so, but I mean, still, I think I need to do at least like some kind of official part of the talk, right, when I would have to present the argument of the book. So probably the easiest way to think about the book is in its connection to the creation of a Siberian branch of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. So this happens in 1957. And that's kind of the only date that grounds the book, because everything else goes in all directions. So I to go a little bit beyond the Soviet collapse in the conclusions, which is not really conclusions, it's really more of an epilogue to the book, a coda of sorts. I end up going, of course, before that, because as I work with biographies, like people do not prefer not to be born at, like, by the cut date that you would prefer, right? So it's a little bit an unruly book in the. But if you want to, like, on one single institutional ground and with kind of structure, the thing, so this is this kind of organizational pinpoint, which is the Siberian branch. And it's very important for the geographical scope of the book and the kind of territorial arguments of the book, because in the end, the book became about territoriality, about late Soviet territoriality, and kind of thinking through what Siberian was in the Siberian branch became the topic of the book. Even though, as many of you know, it indeed started as a story focused on one particular place, which is the computer center in one particular township, which is the Akademgorodok, right, the Siberian science town, which was initially created as the first in a series of these towns, which were supposed to be covering the entire Siberia, and this indeed happened to a certain extent. And this was the place where the presidium, the kind of the governance structure of this Siberian entity for Soviet science was located. All right, so if I was to try to summarize the arguments of the book, the way it came to me, it was about how science became Siberian, how Siberia became scientific. But then, of course, actually, again, it's only meaningful for all of us who already care about, like, the territories of Soviet Union or science in these territories, right? And so I think one of the ways of thinking through how this matters, sort of the ways of considering how such kind of a large-scale process can happen, I was working with several methodological approaches. I ended up naming them in a way, and I think, like, the first one was the first one that I used, like, in a chronological series, and this is the notion of showcasing. This is, of course, not my own notion, but many scholars have used it before me. But the way I'm using it is kind of closer to Michael David Fox. And this idea that this is actually something productive, right? This is not necessarily something like, pulling wool over the eyes, right? But it's about the type of the production of a certain type of gaze, right? And for me, this was incredibly important. But the second part of the spectacle for me is actually the stage, right? In many ways, I have considered this science town as a stage on which this spectacle is taking place. And but the staging is very, very important in the way of kind of type of evidence that I ended up working with. And about this probably just in a moment. Scientific lives, it's just another way of talking about biographies. But what was important to me is how do we get the local identity? And here again, I went in several directions. One particularly productive direction was my engagement with work done by Gabriel Hecht and Paul Edwards, who worked on African experts. And this is sort of, my story is not exactly like theirs, but at least sort of it inspired me to think through this kind of notion of acquisition of localness. And this kind of identity, the Siberian identity of scientists, is very important throughout the book. It is important kind of on practical reasons for two types of people, right? We have at first a massive migration, right, to populate this new structure, this Siberian branch. So from the western parts to the east. But of course, right, at some point, and this is the most difficult chapter, but I ended up with chapter 6, it's also about how kind of Siberian children were eventually brought into kind of the science sphere. And so we have Siberians becoming Siberian scientists. And this is kind of but no, it doesn't fit like it's a kind of a third sub-argument of the book, but this is really important because this was kind of there from the very beginning. And this is what in many ways allowed to perpetuate our Siberian branch as it is. And then it's up to today, I think, so this is kind of educational structure that was created in those days is still very, very present in what's going on in kind of this, even in post-Soviet generation of people who end up very often abroad, right? But they go through these institutional structures, or some of them, of course, stay. Finally, the last category was really made up like a shortcut to reflect on the processes. Right, so I'm not a historian of mathematics. I ended up working a lot on mathematics-related topic throughout the book. And for me, right, again, this was not to figure out something about the discipline itself or like particular mathematics questions, but through kind of the power of the people who are mathematicians had over organizational issues, and the kind of the thinking that they had about what happens more generally, even with modernity itself. And this is where kind of mathematization and modernity actually are connected, but not on exactly my analytical level, but on the level of my actors categories, right? And this is where kind of mathematization was kind of a helpful catchword, though it's probably not precise enough. And this is why, like another not precise word, cultures can help me, right? And this idea was, yes, so this is kind of would be connected not necessarily to the discipline of mathematics itself, but through kind of mathematics as a process that is involved in many kind of things that are happening in this territory. And this is like the range of it is, of course, like no limit, right? And we can talk about actually the minds, right? And these particular educational structures that many of them are oriented toward mathematicians, or it could be like to a kind of, particular new technological phenomena that emerged during that time, such as like satellite imaging and the processing of these images, and how this would, for instance, be taken up in geology. So things like that. So the range is very, very big. But for me, what mattered here is connection to lives and connection to spectacle, connections to the fact that it's not kind of hardware focused. And so that's sort of, I was looking for a category that would enable to encompass all of those things. Okay, so these are, I guess, the most important three things that are happening in the book. In terms of structure, I start with a biography that's Lavrentyev's, the trajectory to Akademgorodok, to becoming a founder father of Akademgorodok, to also undermining his own projection of what it was by kind of recovering some of the conflicts in this story. But sort of this is where kind of biography starts, and this is sort of where scientific lives do really matter, because like this story is very hard to tell without grounded in particular individuals. And basically the methodological challenges, it was my first methodological challenge in the sense, like how to tell a story of a huge place, right, which has all Siberia in it, which has a city built in it, within a life, right? Or is it like the story of a life that they tell the place of a story of a life? And some kind of challenge I grappled in the chapter, which was a separate article a number of years ago. And then kind of some of the findings, like logical answers to myself, I think I implemented it in the chapter, which is chapter 4, which tells the story of Marchuk. But this time, sort of the challenge was not so much the creation of a new entity, right? Because Siberian organization was already there, but sort of more thinking through like a totally different generation, totally different background, because unlike kind of, Lavrentiev had a relatively fancy background, scientific background for his family. Marchuk really comes from a peasant family of Ukrainian Kazakhs. Right, so his integration in science was really through the World War II. So how to take like this very different life, and then in the end, this very different life for me actually was the one that helped me to go to the sculptures of mathematization idea, because Marchuk was the one who, for me, kind of helped me to understand how we think about mathematical methods through his own kind of intellectual preoccupation. And so this is where the two chapters that are grounded narratively in scientific lives. Again, the chapter on Lavrentiev chapters on Marchuk, chapter 1 and 4. In between, I have also lots of scientific lives, but I deal with youths. And these are two chapters. One, basically, if we were to ground it institutionally, but it kind of splits outside these borders. One is about the Novosibirsk State University. So we're thinking about this kind of reproduction of Siberian science, this acquired vocalness. And the second one is about young scientists who are making money in a not always very legal way. But like by talking about money, we end up talking about scientific identities and about values. So those two chapters, they operate not within kind of individual biographies, but within kind of problems or aspiration. And one, again, is about kind of this acquiring scientific identity through educational process, but it turns out that social relations are very, very important. And some of the kind of received narratives that we have about freedom being connected to this kind of distance from Moscow, I re-articulate them as social practices, cultural practices related to acquiring scientific identities. And I think like I'm trying, convincingly or not, but I'm trying to show this not as an escape from Moscow and kind of degrees of liberties that are acquired, but actually as a very conscious, very conscious process, conscious in terms of that the high ups are very much aware of this is happening, and they are instrumentalizing this again for their own goals to the reproduction of local identities. So something like that. Finally, I guess by chapters 5 and 6, we are really in the moment where this argument about how science became Siberian, how Siberia becomes scientific, they are implemented not only kind of as an analytical framework, but as the material of the chapters themselves. It's kind of on the plot level. Because chapter 5, I think I'm trying to deal with the representations of Siberia. And like there are multiple of them, but probably the one where this kind of argument is the most obvious. It's when I'm working with the exhibit, which was called Siberia Scientific, and which would travel throughout the United States in 1975, right after we have like the famous Apollo-Soyuz moment. So this is kind of, like you cannot make Siberia more scientific by presenting your own exhibit about that to your so-called, civilizational enemy. And there are other examples that I'm working with, including actually the program created on the ground by the leaders of the Siberian Branch, which was called also Siberia. And it turns out that this program allows us to go through past the moment of dissolution, or past the 91, and see how this kind of entity, which was created as a kind of platform for coordination with local administrative units on a kind of governmental and industrial level, becomes a coordinating mechanism at the moment of a state collapse. And so for me, it was kind of one of the surprises that I had, the kind of the importance of those structures, of late Soviet structures for the period of transition. So finally, back, I guess, to chapter 6, it's the moment where we have scientists becoming Siberian, but also kind of children becoming Siberian children becoming scientists who are Siberian scientists. And that's the chapter which is grounded in the institutional history of the special physics and mathematics school created, the first such a school in the Soviet Union created in Akademgorodok. From our discussions with Slava, we know that this is somewhat like some things that happened there somewhat different from what he sees, for instance, in the context of Moscow and St. Petersburg. I guess sort of this chapter became, I don't know how it is to read. It is the longest, and it is also the one where I think that many things are happening. So on one hand, it's kind of very cultural arguments about how do you measure intelligence, who is excluded, who is included. There are kind of more social constructivist kind of topics there about the particular pedagogies that are implemented and what are these utopian pedagogies, and on one hand, kind of the promise and the violence embedded in the pedagogy itself, and not in the relationship with the state, which is very often kind of the argument about such type of institutions. I guess the very important part there was also about considering how this kind of very violent remodeling of the individual, which is to happen in such a school, is also considered an asset in cases where actually people have to go through this process one more time when they move abroad. And this is, again, something like what on one hand can be considered as a kind of a violent process, ultimately becomes a tool for like survival, right, or success, even because many graduates of this physics mathematical school, it's mind-blowing how many of them actually have very high-level jobs in like the corporate entities of today's Western kind of technological world. Yes, so that's this kind of they turned out to be incredibly mobile, right? So that's the story, and it could have been the end of the book, but it turns out that yes, I still came up with the code, and the code, I guess, like tries to walk through some of these notions that I have developed, such as acquired localness, spectacle, probably less the question of mathematization, but it does show up in kind of some of the digital projects that I look at, such as the game developed about the history of Akademgorodok. But ultimately, I guess this story was about, well, what it means to be Siberian, and it seems like people on the ground that still have very strong opinions about that. And of course, this is still a kind of, and it was very kind of different to work on a history which is not over, but like the sense that I got from working with very contemporary materials, that people have agents on the ground, that they value this agents, and they have like tricks to deal with the situation. But how much of this agency is still there, I really cannot tell, because the materials I worked with were kind of from the tens and like not into like the early 2000s. The things that I worked at was kind of more of a cultural level. But even on the cultural level, I think like I see some level of resistance. So that's kind of the story that I see. But I mean, like some kind of patriotic identities are also there. So I don't want to say that it's only resistance, right? But probably like, you know, this relationship with Moscow remains not a straightforward one. So I think I can stop there.
All right, thank you, Ksenia. I guess we didn't get to slide 3, did we?
Oh, yeah. I think, yeah, it's not so like it was just the titles of the chapters, right? So I don't think the titles of the chapters are so important.
That's all right. So thank you. We'll now move on to the commentators. Katja, would you like to go first?
I can stop sharing.
Is all right. So let me just introduce Katja Doose. Katja is an environmental historian and a historian of science for Russia and the Soviet Union at the University of Lyon and Fribourg. Her research focuses on the history of Russian and Soviet earth science and the experiences of human-nature interactions from the late 19th to the 20th century. She is currently working on her book manuscript entitled White Coal for White Gold, an environmental history of glacier studies in Central Asia. She leads the SNF project Myths of Equality, a Gendered History of Science in Central Asia, 1870-1970. So Katja, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hi Ksenia, hi Slava, hi everyone else. Yeah, first of all, I would like to say thank you, of course, for inviting me and for giving me this honor to comment on your brilliant book, Ksenia. Yeah, I also want to start, of course, when I met Ksenia, because that's an important thing to say. So I think actually I met you for the first time in 2018, but actually I'm not so sure anymore. When we invited you to a workshop on science, history of science during the Cold War in the framework of John Oldfield's project on the history of climate science. And then you already gave a fascinating talk on Gurimachuk, and I thought, wow, there's another crazy person working on Gurimachuk. And then a year later, we discussed one of your first chapters during the Soviet History Lab in Geneva. And since then, I've received some updates here and there on the progress of your book. And now I can admire how you brought this ambitious and very multifaceted project to completion. I find that Soviet science Siberia offers a remarkable rethinking of Soviet science, not as something imposed from Moscow onto the passive periphery, but as a dynamic reciprocal process. Siberia in this account is not merely a backdrop for science, but as you have said yourself just now, it shaped scientific identities and practices. Yeah, you already said there yourself, but so the book draws on three analytical lenses: scientific spectacle, biography, and the culture of mathematization, in order to show how Soviet scientific identity, place, and ambition were co-produced during the Cold War. The book challenges familiar center-periphery models and invites us to think from the margins and not just about them. So to be honest, at first I was not very sure why Ksenia asked me out of everyone to comment on this book, because I thought it would be much more grounded in mathematics and programming and so forth, so areas where I believe there are many other people who know much more than me about this. But actually the book is about much more. It's about scientific Siberia, about the roles and identities of Soviet scientists in the margins, or so-called margins, and the tension between development and nature protection. And so, yeah, this speaks directly to my own work. As Slava has mentioned, so I'm an environmental historian, working also on science history, currently on Central Asia. Before that, I've worked on Russia and the Caucasus. So, yeah, another so-called peripheries. And her argument that these spaces were not just recipients of knowledge, but also laboratories of innovation and identity, in that sense deeply resonated with me and with my own work. The book is extremely rich in themes, theoretical concepts, topics, and also, to my liking, full of amusing anecdotes, which Ksenia knows very well how to tell in her usual dry sense of humor. But of course I had to make a choice. And so in the following, I would like to speak about three aspects from the book that spoke the most to me, to my own research. So first, I would like to speak about the book's biographical approach. So this is where Ksenia weaves individual life stories into the broader history of institutions, infrastructures, and ideas. This becomes most visible in the chapters on the university lives, but of course also in the figures of Mikhail Lavrentiev, the founder of Akademgorodok, and Gerovitch, his successor. This biographical approach turns these usually very political focused histories of Akademgorodok and these persons into something very personal and tangible. And she shows how people lived scientific lives on a broader scale and how their personalities shape this very science. Her chapters remind us that scientific network and infrastructures are as much as a result of political strategies as of personal interest and personal histories. So, of course, since I worked on Gerovitch, this chapter on Gerovitch stood out to me the most, not only because of the fascinating portrait she draws of a scientist who rose from a Volga village to become a Cold War actor, but also because it speaks directly to questions I've grappled with in my own work on climate modeling. In her main argument on your chapter on Machuk, is what we shouldn't always, she says that we shouldn't always focus on scarcity in Soviet science history, but instead ask how scarce resources are deployed. And so here I felt she was directly speaking to me. Maybe others in the room feel the same, but and I was confirmed actually when I looked at the footnote. So because in one of my articles on Soviet climate science, in which Machuk plays an important role, I focus exactly on that role of scarcity as a key point shaping the scientific output and international engagement. Now, Ksenia in her book does not dismiss scarcity at all, and she doesn't romanticize it, but she decenters it. So instead of treating it as a central explanatory framework, she focuses on what scientists like Machuk did with the resources they had, how they mobilized networks, built careers, staged authority, and participated in transnational science. And so this reframing is more than biographical, it's methodological. It reminds us that Cold War science wasn't just a story of deficits and limits, but of agency, strategy, and aspiration, even under the known constraints. So for me, reading Ksenia's analysis of Machuk's career opened up a valuable comparative lens, and what her book offers is a useful shift in perspective. To focus on the scientist's obvious priorities can sometimes help us even better to explain their choices than by focusing on the material scarcity surrounding them. So in a way, it is a way of seeing scientists not as victims of shortages, but as actors navigating them creatively. The second angle of the book that speaks to me is her very nuanced treatment of the question of coloniality. From a post-colonial STS viewpoint, she argues that Siberia's scientific development in the late Soviet era cannot be fully captured by conventional center-periphery or colonial metaphors. In Ksenia's dialectical formulation, dry as usual, it was a colony and it was not a colony, period. Siberia was developed like a colony with science and infrastructure imposed from above. But the scientists who came there built lives, identities, and institutions that were deeply local. They didn't see themselves as imperial agents, and as Ksenia argues, they saw themselves as Siberians. In that way, I liked your refusal to collapse Siberia into binary of colonizer and colonized, and the concept of hyper-territoriality, where scientists don't just work in a place, but become part of it, captures this very well. And now in relation to my work, it stands in very stark contrast to the case studies in Central Asia, where local embeddedness were often more difficult due to more visible hierarchies. And so her work really invites further comparison. How did different Soviet peripheries enable or hinder scientific belonging? And third aspect is her analysis of the relationship between science and the environment. Because I find that one of the book's original contributions, one of the many original contributions, is how it situates environmental engagement as part of Akademgorodok's identity. Lavrentiev and Marchuk envisioned a science that was to some extent in dialogue with nature, more precisely with Siberian nature. And yet that ideal was often constrained. Lavrentiev's concern about Lake Baikal, for example, were ultimately sidelined. However, rather than judging these environmental campaigns by whether they succeeded or failed, Ksenia reads them as a crisis of modernity, a moment when the foundational logic of Soviet science and governance began to reveal its internal fractures. And so in my last part of my comment, I would like to formulate some questions that are meant to be sort of invitations for further conversation. Based on this last argument I spoke about, so that the debates around rational development and the environment were illustrations of a crisis of modernity, I was wondering how you, Ksenia, see figures like Marchuk and Lavrentiev, but also others in your book, responding to this very crisis. In the process, did they rethink the ideals of planning and technocratic control, or did they find ways to absorb the contradiction and keep the project going? I'm also thinking about the way you frame and, in my eyes, sort of justify Marchuk's apolitical avoidance strategy when it came to environmental issues, and of course, my favorite topic, to climate modeling and his role in it. And a similar tension applies to questions of coloniality. While scientists may have seen themselves as rooted in Siberia, I was wondering how was their work and their activity, their endeavor in Siberia perceived by others? So from what I understood, the center made a Soviet utopia out of it, but how did they frame this move to the margins? Did they use a colonial framing, or and what about, most importantly, what about the local populations, those outside these scientific enclaves? How did they respond to this sort of technocratic utopia in the Siberian forest? And finally, since identity and belonging are so central to your analysis, I wondered about who was actually visible in this vision of scientific Siberia. Women appear occasionally, often in roles like human computers. In your last chapter, they even appear as cleaning ladies and as teachers of the FMS. But their scientific contributions remain largely in the background. So was this an archival silence or an institutional one? And did Siberian science then mean masculine science? Where are the 38% of women that supposedly made up the scientific apparatus in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s? And similarly, the book touches little on ethnic diversity. Were Akademgorodok students and researchers mostly ethnic Russians? Did its vision include indigenous groups like the Buryats or the Yakutsk or others? Or was this utopia built for a narrow Soviet elite? And these reflections draw directly from the book's own emphasis on performance and identity. To conclude, I would like to say that Soviet Siberia is a major contribution to the history of Soviet science. What sets this book apart from earlier works is its methodological innovation and analytical focus. It brings us to the everyday lives of scientists and offers a textured portrait of how scientific authority was performed, how place shaped identity, and how global knowledge flows met Soviet ideals. By blending science and technology studies, biography, visual culture, and regional history, I think this book gives us not only a new view of Akademgorodok and scientific Siberia, but a new way of thinking about Soviet science altogether, which is not as a monolithic apparatus directed from Moscow, but as a composite of place-based identities, methodological performances, and contested ideals. So in this view, science is not just a Cold War weapon or tool of modernization, but it is actually a space of aspiration, as this book very well shows, of tension and belonging. And so that, I think, is what makes this book so rewarding and so necessary.
Well, thank you so much, Katja. Wonderful comments. Next, Ivan Boldyrev. Let's see. Is a philosopher and is an historian of ideas with interests in economics, German idealism, sociology of knowledge, and critical theory. He currently works as assistant professor of history and philosophy of economics at Radboud University, Nijmegen. His most recent publications are co-edited with Thiel Dupe, Economic Knowledge in Socialism, 1945 and 1989, Annual Supplement to History of Political Economy, and The Power of Speculation, Elements of Poetics of Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit. So Ivan, please.
Hello, everyone. I apologize if the connection is not perfect. I'm in the midst of my Paris vacation, but it's really an honor to participate in this, and just let me know if you don't hear me well. And of course, as Slava's introduction demonstrates, I am somewhat an outsider to this community, and feeling, of course, a complete imposter in view of this fantastic and very well researched, very extensively researched book. And my own research only touched upon very small aspects of this huge topic: late Soviet science, late Soviet applied mathematics, and Siberian science. But what I thought, after Ksenia asked me to participate in this presentation, what I thought I could do, or I could contribute, is really very much what Katja just did, which is first show what I learned from the book, and second, try to comment on something, and that could probably be quite helpful. So my feeling of what actually the new or interesting stuff there is in a book is first that it makes seemingly obvious narratives more complex. And I mean, this happens actually almost in every chapter of the book, so that it kind of relativizes very well-known dichotomies. And I mean, take this issue of showcasing, right? The idea that there was all sorts of fake or not real or propagandistic elements. So the book shows that there was indeed some propaganda in Siberian science involved, but it was also more. So it connects to the development of science, and it reminded me also very much of Pasteur and the Latour's famous Pasteurisation de France, which Lavdentiev very much acting like Pasteur in promoting and showcasing his both the science and making science a public endeavor. Second aspect, I learned quite a lot about the history of applied mathematics, and something that was not really clear to me, but became very clear in the story of Marchuk, which was the idea that the careers and the developments of mathematical knowledge were very much socially and, you know, organizationally motivated, and that to make progress, one had to really weigh both the social, political, organizational aspect and the mathematical computational one. That was, I think, very inspiring idea. The third is a very resolute attempt to historicize innovation, to say that innovation was locally defined and that we cannot understand it by, you know, having some broad patterns of ideas of what means innovation, who can innovate, who cannot innovate. I would love to hear more about the debate with Lauren Graham ideas that was not entirely clear to me, partly probably because I have not studied the endnotes quite well. When reading the book online, reading endnotes does not always happens seamlessly. And it also made me think that, well, probably the major actor who was really unable to innovate in the Soviet Union was the Soviet bureaucracy. All the rest were very, very innovative, but the Soviet bureaucracy was not. And the final thing is the idea that seemed very interesting to me, that science, it was also not very new, the idea itself that science contributes to socialist lifestyle, and the socialist lifestyle and science kind of co-define each other. But what happens in the book is that it actually demonstrates how this happened on a very broad historical material, ranging from fiction to ego documents to all sorts of, you know, published academic material. Now about the comments, and this is the second part of my comment, and that I would start with an anecdote. A friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, her father was a physicist in Akademgorodok. And he told me about a certain teacher of French who was very well known, a lady, I guess, who was teaching French to everyone, who created the French club there. All the French people who would come to Akademgorodok were invited in the club. They would watch the movies there, and they would discuss stuff in French, discuss French, I don't know, poetry, literature, whatever. And I got very interested because he was very inspired in his recollections. This is, at that time, he was about 50, now he's about 70 probably. Anyway, and then I was interviewing a couple of mathematical economists with Novosibirsk connections. And I asked them, just out of the curiosity, whether they knew about this French club. And they said, of course, the whole Akademgorodok knew that. What this anecdote demonstrates is that how tightly connected the knowledge was there, how it was really close to each other, how the spatial closeness actually contributed to very, very tight network of connections. In this respect, what interests me would be really kind of, again, something that I didn't find in the book, but how could I? Because the book, I mean, you cannot write the book about everything, but what makes me really curious is really what kind of disciplines were there in Novosibirsk? Could we make a map of those disciplines and trace their genealogies to some path dependencies and choices? I mean, there are obvious ones. I mean, we know that Siberian science is famous for abstract algebra and logic because the great algebraist Maltsev was invited by Lavrentiev to contribute to Siberian science. And I mean, that created all sorts of path dependencies that defined the shape of Siberian mathematics. But other were some disciplines privileged over others, which was certainly the case, but I would love to learn more about that. And what about interdisciplinarity when we have this tight connection between the communities? How exactly the interdisciplinarity worked in the context of Novosibirsk? One possible answer in the book is that actually interdisciplinarity was very much identified with mathematization, really. So mathematization was the name of interdisciplinarity in Novosibirsk. Was it the only game in town? What happened? What sorts of tensions or contradictions could there be, including the tension between the pure and applied, which were really very much a topic, was really very much a topic of the book. And now finally the question of coloniality, which Katja also emphasized, which actually gets some additional dimension here, which is not an easy or not a pleasant one. I mean, all the founders of, or most of the founders of Novosibirsk Science left after some time for Moscow. The majority of the famous scientists I'm aware of, although I don't know the statistics, it would be nice to have a look at that, but most of the people I know of eventually left, right? So we have this picture of, you know, the center, so the country exploiting Siberia, and the country itself being exploited for its oil and gas. So we have kind of exploitation of that. The exploited country exploits its region. Now, how did it actually work? I mean, what was this? You know, can we tell this as a story of coloniality in this particular way? There was one final aspect. If I have, do I have some more time? Like 5 minutes?
Maybe 3.
3 minutes. Okay. There was an important background story, probably one of the most very well-known story in the history of Soviet mathematics. Let's put it this, in which in the book is only touched upon, but very important because it was really about the Soviet-French collaboration, and Marchuk and Lyons, and Lyons was the student of Schwarz, and Marchuk was connected to the Soviet mathematical school, and there was this parallel development of the concept of what is now called the distribution in mathematics, right? And in the book on the history of these distributions, one of the first books on that, the author cites who talked to Schwarz and who asked, I mean, who was the first to create the theory of distributions? And then Schwarz himself refers to the book by Moses Finley on democracy, which says that, look, I mean, there were all sorts of examples of democracy before the ancient Greece. And there were all sorts of, you know, primitive tribes which had some examples of, you know, doing democracy. But only in ancient Greece was the democracy really, you know, a problem of political philosophy, and a kind of a whole theory of democracy was created. So the Greeks are really made a democracy, you know, something that would be general for everyone. So what Schwarz was actually referring to was that Sobolev, the Soviet mathematician, actually applied and created the notion of the distribution, or обобщенные функции, generalized functions, in the 1930s, but only Schwarz, you know, the civilized French mathematician, created the full-fledged theory that could be used by mathematicians all over the world. So this pattern of coloniality, in a very, very weird kind of rendition of Schwarz himself, well, could have been also seen in the interaction between the Soviet and the French, which is not there in the book, because in the book, in the numerical mathematics, they interact on equal footing. But this is also in the background. I mean, this pure mathematics case. I don't know whether Ksenia has some more comments on this background of the Soviet-French mathematical collaboration. Thank you so much. I hope that was not too convoluted.
Thank you, Ivan. Great. So Ksenia, would you like to respond?
Oh, great. Thank you so much. And actually, Ivan was the one who came up with an idea of a table in the first place. So I was like, oh, great idea. Read my book. No, I'm very grateful for this conversation, because I think this is like, we are getting complementary perspectives, and I think that's fun. It's like, I'm delighted, because of course, I do hope that people will find like at least something useful in the book, or something like thought-provoking. And I am very grateful for those comments and questions, because of course they're also pushing my own thought as I'm like thinking about like all the projects I still need to wrap up and the new projects that emerge. Thank you so much. I will try to answer at least some of it. Please forgive me if I like my scattered mind doesn't manage to hold and to be like spontaneously coherent. What I think I heard most kind of directly is the kind of the story how, right, with us, this attempts that I do at decentering, where are the limits? And like one of the limits that Katja has pointed out, right, is like, for instance, the gender question. Or, you know, how do these kind of local identities incorporate those previous identities? I mean, I think, yes, that would be kind of the next thing. But what I was able, I guess, to recover at this particular stage, right? So instead of doing women, I kind of did sexuality, and that's like the carnival part. And yes, masculinity is very, very prominent, and this is what ends up happening in this kind of last chapter when we look into how, for instance, someone like Lyapunov, of whom we know as a father figure of cybernetics, actually becomes kind of a founding father of the physics mathematical school in Akademgorodok. It's a very, very strong presence, right? It is referred to as the godfather, who invites children to his house and reproduces a very particular type of masculinity, kind of intelligentsia masculinity with some military kind of associations, because in his own life trajectory, like his participation in World War II was a defining moment. But at the same time, I've also done this work separately on programming identities and published it out, right? So yeah, I was also trying to balance out, but the question is always with me, and I'm very much preoccupied with it. One of the moments when I also tried to do this was not necessarily with all kind of different ethnicities that we can find in Siberia, but with the Jewish question. I am not sure how well I handled that, because of course it's always very, very complicated, but at least for me it was important to signal that it was there. And this is where kind of I'm bringing it these moments of the conflicts in the dorms, and then kind of a debate reproducing Stalinist forms, and at least that it looks like that people intervene to close this debate, not necessarily because it's about Jewish questions, but because it reproduces Stalinist form. And this is what they don't want. This is like my sense of what have happened. But this, of course, doesn't solve the broader question of how much anti-Semitism was there in Akademgorodok. There is some people think it was less than elsewhere. In order to do like a full study, I think we would need like, you know, a significant new research on it, but at least like I tried to touch upon that. I would love to have a better idea about all kinds of different ethnicities. Again, through this school question, it was very obvious that they went to all these different regions. They're very proud to say like how many Buryat students they have at each of the let's say like summer camps of the school. I don't I didn't get my hands on full statistics, because I think they were counting, like they were counting origins. What was very important to them that they don't only get kind of the white collar professionals as fathers and mothers of these children, but they that had villages. So that the village versus town kind of distribution was very important one for the Soviet statistics, and this is what I see in the documents. And the ethnic distribution, I mean, probably it's possible to recover it again, you know, once we again have the access to archives. What I have like, from anecdotal evidence, it's definitely there. Percentage-wise, it's very hard for me to tell. Kazakhstan was definitely like the largest proportion, but whether they were ethnically Kazakh or rather the Germans, that's what I'm like. What I think what was going on. It was actually like the Germans, and then sort of they were looking for us kind of promotional strategies, and so going to Akademgorodok was one of them. So this is why we have so many people from Kazakhstan. That's probably the explanation. And finally, what is also interesting, what I was able to recover through kind of mostly informal conversations, because I did do some formal interviews, but they do not form like a bulk of the sources that I use in the book. But of course, like, you know, for many years, but all this lasted, I was talking to many people. What is striking very often you meet a person that says, like, you know, like drinking beer with like in Singapore with all the IT, Russian-speaking IT people. And of course, there will be people from Akademgorodok, and then you'll ask them, and it turns out that will be from Buryatia. But when they present themselves, they'll say, like, oh, I'm from Akademgorodok, right? And it was very interesting. And it partially is, of course, just a feature of the fact that you don't need to explain where Buryatia is, you know, and it's still in Singapore. And at least like Novosibirsk is a place that people can point on the map sometimes. But still, right, it was kind of in terms of the self-performance, it happened like multiple times when I had like people who definitely didn't look like ethnic Russians. And then when you ask them where I'm from, it's like Novosibirsk Akademgorodok. And I was like, oh, tell me more. Yeah, so this is kind of the stories that I have encountered. And I absolutely agree that it would be like absolutely like that would be the thing that, you know, if someone else was to pick up on this project, this is one of the things that would be, I think, very, very productive, very, very interesting. Okay, and I think this is where probably I can try to make a transition at least to some of questions that Ivan have asked. And that would be this kind of complicated relationship with like coloniality in multiple stages, right? So it's like, oh, is it the coloniality on the level of the kind of within kind of what we would sometimes describe as an empire, right? The Soviet empire, or is it on the kind of global geopolitical level? Is kind of this formation of science as Eurocentered, especially if we think of things connected to mathematics, right, which is traditionally with strong centers like in Paris and Göttingen, and this is sort of where I start my story when I start Lavrentyev's career when he's even like a child and brought to those centers by his father, who himself benefits from a fellowship and is able to travel abroad with his family. Very, very difficult question, but I think my sense right now is that there is more equality than you would think, because partially, at least for Europeans at this moment, right, because we need to bring in equation the Americans, right? And so the Europeans themselves are no longer the center. And this is why there is more equality with the Soviets, because it's triangulated. Like, so the French-Soviet connection is so strong, partially because they are looking, both of them are looking to the United States, and the scarcity that we are talking about, at least on the level of hardware, the French are facing that as well, because they're also like facing limits on the exports. What we are trying to do is to sell the Soviets some of their hardware and to circumvent some of the, like, I mean, this is like the conversation that we're having right now about China chips, and so it's like, yeah, so we're back to the same story, right? So all those things were happening on the level of both hardware and people who were like working with the methods, mathematical at the limits of hardware, right? This is where the cooperation was in equal partnership, because like the problems were the same. So this is sort of where it is more equal. But yes, I think like this is a dynamic story, right? And I think the story changes immediately in the 90s, where French are very much aware that you know, the American might be like
Ksenia, I think your kind of video is
of course,
frozen.
this is not kind of a stable entity.
Yeah, Ksenia, I think your video was frozen and some of the things you said were lost. Could you maybe turn off video and repeat your last words? to save the bandwidth.
Video, is it better? Am I back?
Yeah. Now audio is fine. If you could repeat just the last thing you said.
What was the last thing? Okay, very good. So I guess, I mean, anyway, so it's just a triangulation of geopolitics. It reflects like the contemporary dynamic to a certain degree, and this is not like, but it's not one framework which described, I think, the entire period. So there is kind of a bit of a dynamic, especially if we look into the careers of the people when like Lyons and Marchuk acquired power themselves, that the Swedes were able to influence that. So something like that. But at the same time, I see like a similar dynamism in Lavrentiev interactions with the West when he is able to bring students because of how high he is in the administrative hierarchies. Yeah, so I think like, so the question can be, we'll get one type of story. If we look into like the biographical trajectory, we'll have a somewhat different configuration if we structure it by kind of geopolitical situation through a series of bilateral agreements, for instance, on which we didn't touch at all, but that kind of underline some of those stories of transnational and international cooperation that we have mentioned and that are in the book. Yeah, so I am probably not answering everything, but maybe there are more questions and maybe some of the things that I didn't answer will come back one more time.
All right, thank you very much. I don't know, can you turn now video on? Because we want to see you. Yeah. All right, good. So, of course, your work relates in so many ways to my own, and I'd love to talk more about that, but I really want to open the floor for the questions from the participants. So please, if you have a question, the simplest thing, please put a question mark in the chat. That would clearly create a line of questions, or if you prefer, you could raise your digital hand. All right, so the first question mark comes from Alexei Golubev. Okay, go ahead, Alexei.
Hi, Ksenia. Hi, Slava. Hi, everybody. I have a pretty straightforward question. Who was bankrolling this Праздник жизни? Who was, funding the original construction of the Akademgorodok? And then who was funding the sort of annual budget of the Siberian branch, where the money came from, in other words?
Thank you. Yes, the money question is great. It's not the most important for kind of what I do, because I do more of what they do with the money that they got. But in terms of the administrative, it is the Russian Republic. And this is why it's sometimes, right, people consider it, the Siberian branch is like giving a Republican kind of academy to the Russians. Because we are working within kind of a larger movement of creation of this kind of national, so to speak, Republican academies throughout the Soviet Union. But of course, this is like, it's not very, very precise if we speak this way, because this is not what Lavrentiev wanted at all. But like, if we'll just look for the money, so the main bulk of the money comes through the Russian Republic. And this is where Lavrentiev had like very, very close connections, and things go not as well by the time he retires, and partially like his retirement is connected to the loss of those connections in the kind of the government on the Republican level. But actually in practice, and this is very hard, again, I have very little numbers because like on the archival level, I mostly worked with archives, again, of course, of the computer center. A tremendous part of kind of funding came through the military-industrial complex, right? With почтовые ящики, right? So this is like a lot of this was happening, and for me, like some of this became visible precisely through the story of Torch, which was able to turn this money into cash, right? And again, fund some of the things that actually like had no budget, because part of the like even reason for the creation of this kind of consulting organization that they called Torch was the fact that, of course, Lavrentiev was very much concerned with kind of instruments, infrastructures, building the roads, building the institutes. He was less concerned with buying musical instruments or yachts to entertain young people. And this is all of those things we're able to obtain through this Torch organization. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Other questions? All right, Alexei Kozhevnikov. Alexei, go ahead.
Yes. Does it work, the mic?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. I also maybe kind of ask a simple question like Alexei, but maybe two or three kind of linked together. Geography can be constraining, but it can also be liberating. So it often happens that people who are far away from, let's say, the center of control or the center of power, in some sense feel that they cannot do certain things that people at the center can do. But in some other situation in the country, they kind of they sometimes allow not necessarily exceptions, but just being far away kind of from the centers permits them to do certain things that people kind of let's say in Moscow would not be able to do. I wonder if kind of any of your respondents had comments on that, kind of relative, I don't know, advantages, disadvantages of being far away from the center. And the second is about motivation. Ivan said that most founders left. I'm not sure that's actually true. I think some of them stayed there until their death, but still there was a very significant flow of people in and out, and many people were returning from. There's sometimes in the history of Soviet science, there are several waves, there are several ways of attempts of decentralization. When scientists are sent from Moscow and Leningrad to kind of faraway places. And then these waves are often replaced with maybe just inertia, kind of, or the usual gravity of the, where the main centers started attracting back, or the traditional centers started attracting back people. So and such cycle repeats several times kind of in the course of Soviet history. But in your situation, so I understand kind of initially one of the main motivations for people to move there, at least for the young people, was housing. And the promise to get a housing for new families. How do people who then move to Moscow, how do they describe their motivations? Was it mostly for career promotion, or just was it for them just a next step in the career kind of further up, or was it dissatisfaction? So generally, kind of, if you can put some patterns, kind of, how did those who returned from Novosibirsk back to, let's say, European part, so how do they describe the reasons?
Okay, so there are several questions, and yes, and thank you for bringing me back to some of Ivan's questions. Right. So I think we are back to, I think, this one of the fundamental questions about the freedom. And at the same time, I think when I'm answering this, it's back to Ivan's question about the interdisciplinarity, or kind of a disciplinary outlook of the city and how that worked at the same time. Because I guess the two of those questions were answered in very important book that I didn't spend much time citing, because I think that's sort of what Paul Josephson has already done for the story, right? So for him, it was the story when people go away from Moscow, right, and create all those different disciplines. And we have a map of what happens in physics, what happens in biology, what happens in geology, right? He has every chapter which is discipline oriented. So I didn't want to repeat that. And of course, for those of you who are interested, that's of course a wonderful resource which is there, right? And so for it all kind of maps in a kind of rise and fall story for Paul, right? With the sources he was able to access when he was writing this in the late 90s, right? So we have a rise with the thaw, and then the thaw goes down, and the story of the city goes down. So for him, it's a story of failure, right? It's an utopia that kind of ultimately fails. right, but sort of the disciplinary map is in there, and sort of the story of the freedom is in there. So again, one more time, so for me, the question of freedom and the conflicts that I see on the ground is actually kind of the other way around, right? So but locally, and that probably also back to Katja's question, right? How locals perceive them. So for locals, Lavrentiev is a Moscow boy, right? So the conflicts are not with Moscow. Moscow is the patron, right? And the conflicts are with the local administration, right? And of course, it's just like the usual scrambling for resources. Who is like paying for this road? Who is paying for like sewage? Like things like that, right? Because of course, like Akademgorodok is integrated in the urban infrastructure of Novosibirsk. So this is sort of where kind of the questions of freedom are a bit trickier on the ground, and it's sort of we need to see which kind of freedoms are we talking about. But of course, it became a kind of a liberating moment when we think about the disciplinary or institutional constraints. And this is Alexei is absolutely right. People moved for housing, but housing for the laboratories as well, right? Because we have new institutes, and in these institutes you can do things that you cannot do in your old institutes, probably because you have all the colleagues that have like very concrete ways about what they want to be happening in their laboratories, right? So someone like Butker had a vision, right, and was able to get space to realize his vision. His vision grew so big that, you know, there are conflicts with Lavrentiev, but still, you know, he remains. And there are some people whose vision started to conflict with Lavrentiev, and they had to go, right? And one of the examples, actually among the founding fathers, right, we typically name three, right? It's Sobolev, Lavrentiev, and Kristianovich, and that's kind of the story that I inserted in the revised version of which, right, Kristian goes away, and this is a story of the wives, of course, because it becomes a story of his love affairs, but not, right? But he has to go away. So this is kind of an example of how representative. So there will be a fraction of people who would move out, or not necessarily even go to Moscow, but go elsewhere, right? It's like the medical story is the story where initially actually the computer center is, the building was built for the medical institute. And ultimately, right, we have the medical institute built outside Akademgorodok, funded by Medical Academy. And sort of it becomes kind of a separate entity, but also very, very famous in terms of kind of the medical Siberian landscape, but because of the kind of personal conflicts of Lavrentiev. So that's kind of one type of things that was mostly on the very high profile level. On the much lower level, my sense is that very often it's like exactly as you have mentioned, right? It's career opportunities. It's sometimes family circumstances, because for instance, someone like, again, people who are high up in the hierarchy, like Lapunov, he was able to move his entire family, right? So his grandchildren are around him, so he doesn't need to travel to Moscow to see them. And so like no particular, so he dies in Akademgorodok, right? While other people ultimately have like family members elsewhere, and, you know, for many reasons they move in there. Another trajectory which I actually tried to trace, again, it's not the primary one, but I spent some time mapping how we decenter from Akademgorodok in other Siberian locations, and that's the Omsk story that I have in chapter 2, when we have like these young students from Novosibirsk ultimately having a conflict in Omsk. I also trace this in the King Orban, who himself, right, is excluded from this school for talented mathematical kids. Body, I guess, cannot handle that. Then through, okay, I skip because his story is so fascinating, so I'll just skip all the kind of tragic details so you can read it or kind of check him out. Alexander Gorban is like a very, very interesting figure in artificial intelligence up to today. He's still alive, so he ends up finding a career despite his dissident background in Krasnoyarsk, then eventually moves to England. And the last thing I hear from him is that he's back to Russia. He moved to Russia like last year, right? So how do you explain this trajectory? Like what I find on the official sources, like it's to see his grandchildren, right? Right, so it's like, yeah, these are potentially like different reasons. And again, we probably would need to look into different generation of people, but yes, very, very interesting question worth thinking about kind of those trajectories. Yeah, so it's a place where people come and go, and I think this was very, very important for me. So again, this is a very important question because like I was thinking about, of course, the Magnitogorsk, right, as one of the examples of a book centered on one particular place. And so for me, it was important that I don't have a sense this is in and out.
All right. I think, Ksenia, unfortunately, your last sentence was again lost because of your video. Can you turn off the video for a second and repeat the last sentence? Ksenia?
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. My point was that I was thinking about a very important book in our field, which is Kotkin's Magnetic Mountain, where Magnitogorsk is like a model, right, on which like many things like Stalin's civilization happen. So, and Akademgorodok as an open space where this movement is defines how the frontiers of what is science, what is Soviet lifestyle is reconfigured through movement. Yeah, so it was kind of one of the narrative or analytical challenges that I took on, or all kind of imposed on myself and on the reader.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. Next question, Yelena Kochetkova.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I think yeah. That's that's great to be here. Actually, and yeah, I'm very happy to know that this book is out. I don't have it on my bookshelf, but I will definitely get it. I had a question which you actually discussed, but maybe I will leave it as kind of specifying question. Because I've been thinking about the concepts of center and periphery as well, but I didn't hear that these two words were in this discussion a lot. So and Ksenia, can you hear me? I'm not pretty sure because I don't see you and can see your reaction. Can you just let me know that you hear me?
I would want you to repeat the gist of it.
Okay, that's my feeling. That I don't hear it. Yes, I've been thinking about the center and periphery, not from the perspective of personal stories, but in terms of the interplay between, geography, knowledge, and power. So do you find it useful? Again, I haven't read a book, and I will definitely do it, because I'm expecting a copy. But do you find it interesting and important, to decentralize the stories, to kind of decentralize Soviet history? And can you speak a little bit on this interplay between periphery and the center in this meaning, right? It's kind of something between the power, geography, and knowledge, maybe something else. Yeah, maybe you do it in your book. Yeah, but yeah, let's come back to that.
Yeah, so in a sense, right, again, what's the argument? No, I think it's important, right? I guess I'm trying to say, and this is why I came up with this questionable title of Siberia, right? Is that so Siberia in my story is not a place.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a place precisely because it's rather like a projection of those relationships between power and expertise. And both power and expertise are much more situational than mapped on the kind of stable location. Oh, Moscow is the center and Siberia is the periphery. In a sense, Akademgorodok becomes a new center and creates new peripheries. And the dynamic can be reversed, again, in the case of Marchuk. His work on the so-called periphery is considered so important that he's needed in the center, right? It's back to previous questions, like why would people leave? Well, in case of Marchuk, he had a very, very comfortable position. Everything was working. It doesn't seem like he was looking to integrate the government, but he didn't, of course, let this opportunity pass by, right? So he's called on Moscow to manage Moscow stuff because he was so successful in managing the region, and the region was so important to Moscow, right? So this kind of expertise acquired on this scale, like, is getting integrated, right? And this, in this sense, right, like back to, I guess, a very interesting comment with one hand on kind of innovation and bureaucracy, right? Like Soviet bureaucracy is notoriously is notorious for its inefficiencies, but it's still had in some aspects, right? For instance, identifying a useful person, this is what have happened, right, in the case of Marchuk, right? Or within kind of the local bureaucracies, right, we were able to create a new structure, which is the Siberia program, to compensate for some of the kind of structural inefficiencies of the interregional relationship in the late Soviet kind of planning and governance system. So they came up with this program on their own. They sold it to Moscow. Having Marchuk in Moscow helped them. All right. And so this kind of informal structure, well, became formalized this like in ridiculous series kind of, oh, we're doing conferences, right? This is kind of, yeah, this was a bureaucratic structure, which is relatively innovative. This is kind of, those moments do happen, right? So this is sort of where kind of the knowledge and power intersect in the most visible ways in my story.
All right, thank you. Any more questions? Looking for questions, the question marks in the chat. Any other questions? A warning, if not, I'll have to ask a question. So let me ask you a question. So first I want to say that I really like the book, and I think what is interesting feature of it is that there is a lot of interesting theoretical and historiographic discussions that's weaved into the narrative in the book. So it's not that, just first tell a story and then you kind of have some kind of theoretical analysis. It's not that kind of a book. In this book, on almost every page, you would see this kind of interesting historiographic and theoretical connections and some new concepts offered or revisions of some old concepts. So I think this book appeals far beyond a narrow group of people interested in the history of Siberia or history of Akademgorodok. I think it's a very interesting, provocative in many ways book. And my question is about one particular theoretical concept that kind of relates to my current interests, that is cultures of mathematization. Mm-hmm. And I would be curious, how would you contrast that particular concept with the concepts that I developed many years ago of cybernetization of Soviet science? And many years have passed, and I'm sure now it's time to really criticize my old theoretical framework. So I would be fine with that. But just to remind you, what I viewed as a cybernetization of Soviet science was an interesting combination of kind of an epistemic move on the one hand, where cyberneticians started reformulating key concepts of various scientific fields in the language of cybernetics, and thereby trying to discredit some of these theories in other fields, mostly associated with the kind of Stalinist times that were viewed as dogmatic theories or even pseudoscientific theories. Discredit them as being sort of not being able to be translated into this kind of objective cybernetic language. And so on the one hand, is this epistemic move using scientific language as a tool. On the other hand, it's obviously a kind of socio-political move within the scientific community, trying to shift the power from the old Stalinist era elites to the new kind of newcomers or some of the old Stalin era suppressed marginalized scientists who would now use the cybernetization as a way to change the balance of power within those disciplines. So it's a combination of epistemic move and a social move. From your perspective, mathematization, as you understand it, what exactly does it do? And is there also a kind of an epistemic and a kind of a power side to it?
Right. I guess, right. So this is the main, like, plane where I think there is a difference, right? I think in my case, like the infrastructure building is sort of my starting point. And yes, and then sort of the language and the social political is built on top of the infrastructure building, I guess. So that's kind of the only difference, but like the major difference. I was also wondering, right, because the book could have been not instead of Siberia, it could have been Psy with CY, right? That would be almost like I have thought about it, and actually, yeah, for like this is yes, I really had to step out of this, and it's from what I see in the sources, right? The cybernetics is not like it's prominent. It's of course because it was prominent everywhere, right? I'm not trying to say that it was not, but it seems like really it's mathematics and not cybernetics that was the key notion for the people again, right? For someone like this is where kind of Lavrentiev, Marchuk, and Lapunov, right, among the main figures that I have, would be exactly in the same space of conversation, right? And all of them would be connected to cybernetics in one way or another. But so Marchuk would never mention it, almost never, right? So it's like it's very interesting. The very absence of it is like kind of curious, and it's more about who was included and who was excluded about the kind of cybernetic conversations. Because given how kind of opportunistic he was, like not trying to to make this as a fault of a character, but I mean, if he had a way to do something useful with cybernetics, I think he would have done it. But so the fact that he's not using it at all, it means like he's not part of those conversations, and given how powerful he is, right? So this is kind of where the limits are in very, very concrete way, but on the kind of a more, what you're asking, a much more kind of theoretical question. So again, my kind of immediate response would be, it looks like that the infrastructure building was kind of part of this kind of, it was almost a civilization of mathematization in a sense, right? If I was to clarify my concept, right, it's almost kind of a civilization in the sense that it's building it through these things, like the way you develop curriculum for the at the Novosibirsk University, or of course, like very quickly they came up with this idea of how badly they needed the specialized school for young children, because what they were lacking are the very good students for the university, because of course, like the competition with the Moscow, Leningrad, and the other established centers of education was very, very, very strong. So back to kind of the idea of yes, I think what worked for you in cyberspeak, right, because it captured very well this kind of interdisciplinary language, right? And so in Akademgorodok, yes, interdisciplinarity, I think like, yes, mathematical methods are considered as kind of this ground for interdisciplinarity. This is why we have the sigma sign on the emblem of Akademgorodok. So it's the sum of efforts, sum of kind of interdisciplinary, this kind of epistemic efforts. But I think there is something about this kind of new role of the people who are mathematicians, who take on this leading organizational positions. And even when Lipunov, who is a cybernetician, who finds himself in this position, his language is not a language of cybernetics, but a language of mathematization.
Right, thank you very much. Any other questions? All right, so let us thank Ksenia, Ivan, and Katja, and everyone who asked questions, participated in the discussion. I think it was a wonderful discussion. Let me encourage everyone to buy the book and learn from it.